Welcome back. We are in module 7. We are discussing the second language acquisition. Before that, we have discussed about first language acquisition through various parameters of phonology, morphology, syntax, so on. Now, we are looking at the second language acquisition, as in the language that is learned after the first language has been learned. So, after the native language or L1 or various other names used to be in vogue before, let us just call them L1, first language. So, after the first language has been learned, the second language sometimes follow. These days it is quite common to find people who are bilinguals, even multilinguals. This was not so prevalent before, but there were always bilinguals around. So, as a result of which second language acquisition as a matter of study has also has a rather long history. It started way back in the first part of 1900s, 1930s, 40s and so on. So, this is what we are discussing now. Till lecture 2, we have discussed about the various basic understanding about the SLA, its history and so on. So, today we will start with the theoretical approaches. So, what are the main theoretical approaches? There are many, because as I just said, the SLA as a discipline has a long history. So, there are multiple theories and multiple groups of theories, let us say. So, within each group there are different versions of the same with slight modifications, sometimes a little bit of updating and so on. We will try and see the broad overview as always, because each of them would take a lot of time if we go into detail. So, today we will start with the contrastive analysis and move on to other features and end with universal grammar. So, universal grammar we have already discussed in detail before. So, here we will just look at how universal grammar applies to second language acquisition. But first contrastive analysis, because this is one of the very first theoretical approaches towards understanding second language acquisition. Now, SLA formally was established sometime in the 1960s. However, the ideas have been around for a long time, how second language affects first language or otherwise other mental functions. We have already discussed how bilingualism or second language acquisition was not considered a very good thing to happen to anybody. It was considered a pathology and so on. So, basically the idea has been around, the scholarly interest was always there, and but as a discipline, as a systematic way of process of understanding, this was established somewhere around 1960s. So, because contrastive analysis predates this establishment, so it also has the theoretical underpinning of contrastive analysis also predates the later theoretical perspectives. And that time the dominant theoretical perspective within linguistics as well as in psychology was structuralism and behaviorism. So, as a result of which CA, we will call it CA from now onwards. So, CA was based on structuralism and behaviorism, because those were the predominant theories at that time. So, because it is based on structuralism and behaviorism, the primary focus of CA was looking at the surface structure of the languages in whichever is under consideration. So, whichever LA and L1 and L2 are there, the structural properties of those languages were the first thing to be studied within the contrastive analysis system. So, what does it mean by surface structure? All the structures that we have discussed so far. So, phonology, morphology, syntax, these are the surface structures. So, the structural properties of language 1 and language 2, that were the first focus of the contrastive analysis. So, basically this was a bottom up approach, bottom up analysis. So, bottom up as in what is there already, it is the data, that the stimulus that is out there, from there you build up the story as to what is probably happening, that is why it is called bottom up. So, focusing only on primarily on the structural properties. Secondly, after you have looked at the structural properties of both L1 and L2, now the idea, the second thing that followed in CA was the idea of transfer in learning. So, the properties that L1 has and the properties that L2 has, there is some sort of a transfer that happens from one to another. So, one primarily from L1 to L2. That is why it is called contrastive analysis. There is a contrast, comparison and contrast that happens between L1 structural properties and L2 structural properties. Okay. So, the idea of transfer works like this: the properties of L1 might be transferred towards L2 when somebody is acquiring a second language, because these properties are already in place. We discussed it in the light of L1 acquisition and L2 acquisition. By the time you learn L2, another language is already in place, which is not the case with L1. So, in case of L1, there is no chance of impact of previously learned system, but when it is L2, another system is already in place. So, there is an opportunity, there is a possibility of changing shifting those properties from L1 to L2. That is what contrastive analysis talks about. So, the depending on various factors, the transfers can be of two types. Transfer from L1 to L2 was already taken as a given, but depending on the structural properties, the comparison between the structural properties of L1 and L2, the transfer could be of two types, positive and negative. Positive is the surface structure of L1 and L2 are similar. So, in this case, if the L1 and L2 are similarly structured, let us say their phonology is similar. I did discuss about phonology. So, if L1 and L2 has the same set of phonemes, then there is no problem in learning those phonemes of the new language fast. But if there is a slight difference between some sounds that are there in L1 and those sounds are not there in L2, L2 has a different set of sounds which are not there in L1. So, there you will see some problems with adjusting. So, that is what is being talked about here. So, positive transfer is when L1 and L2 have similar kind of surface structure. So, then it is why is it positive? It is positive because in this case the transfer will help learning the L2. So, in this case it facilitates learning because the structure is already there. Similarly, for morphological system, let us say. So, in English you have the inflectional morphemes to denote time of action or aspects or tense aspect and those things. So, suppose you are learning another language with similar structure, you will simply carry this forward and learn. So, it will help you, that is why it is called positive transfer. Then there is the idea of negative transfer as well, that is when the L1 and L2 structures are different, and this is when the transfer of features from L1 to L2 will not only not help, but it will also hinder, because you are trying to transfer L1 specific features to L2 features, and L2 does not have those features. That is what will give us a lot of errors, and as a result of which this is called interference. So, in the first case, in case of similarity, we have a positive transfer, which basically means that it helps learning, facilitates learning L2. In case of the difference in structure, the transfer will anyway happen, but it will result in interference, because you are not, this is not a blank slate, you are learning already, you are learning when there is another language already. So, it will interfere with your new language learning. So, how the contrastive analysis process really goes? So, the description of L1 and L2 structural features will be first discussed in detail, and then they will be compared, and then find structures that might cause problem in learning L2. So, setting aside the features that are similar, the problematic areas are where there is no similarity, where there is different kind of structure in L1 and L2 for the same kind of purpose, let us say, same kind of grammatical purpose. So, those are the cases that might cause problem. So, that has to be identified. Now, why was this to be identified? There was a not only for the sake of just finding out the differences, but they also had another goal, which was to create language teaching material. So, if you know where the learners are going to face problem, you will be able to create your teaching material in such a way by giving more attention to those details that the learner will be able to overcome those interferences. So, that was basically the idea. So, which structures needed more attention, structures in L2, which of the structures in L2, grammatical structures in L2 that needed to be dealt with more attention, that was the ultimate goal of this. So, Lado is one of the main proponents of this theory. So, this is he gives you a three-way distinction between the differences. So, the easiest L2 structures are those that are those already present in L1 in the same form. There are different kinds of, so it is a gradient kind of a structure between when you map L1 to L2, there can be three possible comparisons. One is everything is same. So, for example, let's say language 1 and language 2 both has S, this morpheme to denote let us say plural. So, in that case you start using the other one. So, this will be this kind of a structure will benefit quite a lot from the transfer from L1 to L2. Another structure can be a structure in L2 that does not have similar form in L1, but has the same meaning encoded differently with same distribution. So, distribution as in where all those words can be utilized, right. So, that can be that is another way of looking at it. So, may not have similar form, not the exact form, but there are the similar kind of distribution. We will see the examples as Lado gives one by one. And the third kind is when there is partial or no overlap in structure in L1 in form, meaning and distribution. So, one is the form and meaning both are similar, another is form does not have a similar form, but the meaning is same and the distribution also is same, and the third is where there is partial overlap or no overlap. So, these are the examples that he gives. So, for example, in he gives the example from Spanish and English. The first one for same form and meaning, different distribution. So, in this case, for example, in Spanish, this means the dove, the white dove. So, in Spanish it comes the other way, and so the white dove and white doves. So, in the plural the also gets, so this is where the change happens in plural in Spanish. Here this is singular and this is plural. So, basically it is like doves, whites like this. Similarly, here also and here. So, this marker goes on to each and every component of the sentence, but in English that does not happen. In English the number comes only here. So, this is what we call distribution. So, both cases the S marking denotes plurality. So, the meaning and the form are same, but distribution is slightly different, but this is not that much of a problem. So, this is the first layer. Similarly, same meaning, but different form. So, here this is I and this is I will go and this is I will go. So, this is another case where the form is not same, but the meaning is same. Then same meaning and different form and distribution. So, in Spanish this is water and English this is water, but here the distribution is very different. For example, in English water can be used as a noun, as a verb and as a compound. So, you can have this is water, water the garden, or as a water pipe. These are possible ways of compounding or using it as a verb or as a noun. So, English has a very different kind of a distribution of the word water, simple one single word water, but in Spanish it can occur only as a noun. So, that is in the same form. In English you do not need to change the form, the water remains water in all these different cases. So, this is another. Then you have different form, partial overlap in meaning. So, in Spanish there are different kinds of words for the concept of leg in English. So, in English you have leg, but in Spanish leg of human, leg of animal, leg of a race. So, last leg of the race in English you can still use the word leg itself. So, English has only one word, whereas Spanish makes a distinction between all these three different kinds of places where leg, the concept called leg can be used, and they also have different form. So, this is another case. This is slightly more difficult case, because the learner has to figure out where to stop using the word and where not to. Similar form, different meaning. This is what is called false friends or homophones. So, assisted and assist, but in Spanish it means to attend, but in English it to help, to assist somebody. So, these are different kinds, these are different layers of when you compare Spanish and English, these are the different types of comparison that Lado gives. Now, on the basis of this, there are errors that were explained away, that because of this kind of distinction in the comparison, there are different kinds of errors that happen. However, this, like all theories, this also had drawbacks, that it could not explain many of the errors. That was one big drawback with this theory. So, eventually contrastive analysis made way for later theories, most importantly the error analysis theory. So, in the leading scholars in contrastive analysis are Charles Fries and Robert Lado. Of course, there are many more, but these are the main names. Now, after this came in error analysis. Error analysis came around 1970s, and this happened because of the different kinds of problems that CA faced, inability to explain various kinds of errors. So, this the major shift here, however, is not only to explain the errors, but how you explain the errors. The shift here primarily had happened in the domain as to what is your point of departure. In CA, it was the point of departure was the surface structure, the sound, the words, the morphology, and so on. In case of error analysis, the focus shifted to the internal ability or internal process of the learner himself, herself. So, the reason for this was by that time mentalism was already there, the Chomsky's universal grammar was already proposed, it was quite popular. So, the idea had the whole focus shifted on the inner working of the human mind, and that is why the focus of error analysis also shifted to internal ability of the learner to create language. Right. So, this is based on the description and analysis of the actual learner errors in L2 rather than on idealized linguistic structures, because the CA was looking at the structural properties of the two languages as they should be, but not exactly as the learner had produced them. This is an important distinction. Here they were looking at the data itself, the data that the learner had produced, the kind of L2 the learner produced. On the basis of that, they were looking at the possible theories as to how to look at it. So, that because of this, because in the meantime mentalism, as I just said, mentalism was already there. So, they focused on the underlying rules, because universal grammar talks about the underlying rules. So, here also this theory also focused on the underlying rules rather than on the surface forms. So, Corder is one of the biggest names here. So, he kind of pulled out errors from the dark dungeon as a bad thing. He said that errors are not bad habits, this need not be eradicated, because errors tell us how the human mind is producing the new language, or how the human mind is creating the understanding of the new language in the learner's mind. That is the main point that is important within this, because errors point out the underlying system that one is using. What is the system that he is using? As a result of which there are window to the learner's mind. So, in errors in this case are not markers of interference, because in CA the idea was errors happen because you are trying to, the L1 is trying to interfere with the L2 structures, and hence you have a problem, you have errors as an output. But here the idea is not of interference, but how the person is trying to figure out the entire thing, how the L2 learning is actually following certain underlying rules, and what are those rules we will be able to know from the errors that they make. That is the idea. So, this is kind of Ellis lists the entire process. So, collection of sample from the learner language, then identification of the errors. There is also division made in between the systematic and the mistakes. Systematic errors are the ones that are of interest here, because those are the errors that tell us about the rule the person is following. So, because the same kind of mistakes will happen across domains, but mistakes they separate out, because mistakes are those that might be momentary lapse of memory or other kinds of problem with pronunciation and stuff. So, that is not important. Important feature is the systematic error, which need to be described following this. So, description of errors as per language and grammatical level. For example, you can talk about auxiliaries. So, what are the systematic errors the learner of English as an L2 are making within the domain of auxiliaries. So, that is how the description will go, and then explanation of errors, evaluation, ambiguity and so on. So, a detailed description of the errors that the learner is producing in a specific language when they are learning it in L2, and then understanding them as through some kind of an underlying rule. That is the main idea. One of the main leading scholars in this is Pete Corder, and this is the main publication that we are talking about here. Then the idea is, then another important idea was of the interlanguage IL. So, this is also based on similar kind of concepts of, that is of EA. Interlanguage refers to the intermediate stages of a learner's language. So, when you start learning an L2, you go from very low proficient to high proficient, and in between there are many stages. So, those are intermediate stages where you are making changes. So, gradually you make changes. In the initially you may have a very simple sentence structure, eventually you understand the morphology of the language, and eventually you are able to use them properly and so on. We have already seen that these stages may not map one to one on the L1 acquisition, but L2 acquisition has its own structures, and because those structures are based on stages, and those stages are sometimes called interim grammar, but the more common name is interlanguage. So, this is the intermediate stage between the initial stage and the final stage. So, this is also considered to be a creative process driven by inner forces. This is characterized by influence from both L1 and L2. However, this is not considered to be a bad case of L2 or too much of interference of L1. The main difference here is that the IL makes is that IL is a third system. It is a third space between L1 and L2, but it is a third space. It is not a bad version of L2 or an approximation of L1 or anything. It is a different form altogether. So, the characteristics, primary characteristics, of course, there are adequate literature on this, one can look up, but these are basic characteristics of IL, that is systematic, dynamic, variable and reduced form. Systematic, as the name suggests, that IL, the interlanguage or interim grammars follow a systematic pattern, generally, typically, overall. Of course, there are variations, individual variations, or depending on languages there might be slight changes here and there, but overall there is a systematic pattern through which interlanguage progresses from the beginning to the end structure. Similarly, dynamic, it is a system of rules which learners have in their mind that changes frequently, because that is why you have stages of interlanguage. Interlanguage is not one fixed state, it is a many states between before the final L2 ultimate attainment stage is achieved. Those are the in between stages. So, this is a dynamic process constantly in flux, that is another important thing. Variable, because differences in context sometimes even though it is systematic, but still it has room for variability. Those variabilities are based on different patterns of language use, the reason for which they are used. For example, if you do not need to use the language beyond a few specific domains, then it might have some impact on the interlanguages that the person will go through, as opposed to, let us say, you are learning your L2 for being able to read the literature in that language, being able to write in that language. That could be one goal. Another goal could be just to get by in a foreign country. So, depending on those and depending on the pattern of use, the variabilities might be seen. And reduced form, of course, it is less complex in grammatical structure, because that is the whole point. Once you have achieved the entire complex grammatical structure, you are a good speaker of the L2. So, that is why this the intermediate stages will have less complex grammar. One of the most important name in this domain is that of Larry Selinker. Then we move on to our monitor model. This is another very important milestone in second language acquisition research, and one of the biggest names had proposed this. So, this is proposed by Krashen. So, the idea here is that this is also based on the understanding of internal mechanism, and as opposed to the previous models, though they also used the internal mechanism, underlying rule governed phenomena, but they were not doing it explicitly, that was implied. But in case of monitor model, Krashen explicitly used the language acquisition device, the idea of language acquisition device to create the understanding of monitor model, to propose this model. And this model remained quite influential in the US, particularly in the language teaching, domain of language teaching. In fact, even today many scholars do refer to Krashen's theories, not only this, even the updated later models as well. So, Krashen has remained very influential and relevant in this domain. But anyway, going back to monitor model, this was also very important for language teaching domains, and it remained so 80s, 90s, very important theory. So, the main hypothesis of the model is that the primary distinction that they make between acquisition and learning. That is an overtly expressed distinction that this theory makes between the acquisition and the learning. So, acquisition is subconscious, acquisition is what happens for L1. So, when you are learning your L1, it is an almost like subconscious, or you may not be conscious at all when you are learning the language. So, that is what he considers as acquisition, and this is not the same as when you are learning a second language. Second language is conscious. This is something we discussed before also, that there is a voluntary effort that is needed for learning a second language. So, that is the distinction he also makes. He says that this is second language should be called learning, first language, in case of first language it can be used as acquisition. And then the monitor hypothesis. So, what is learned is available only as a monitor for purposes of editing or making changes to whatever that has already been produced. So, there is a monitoring process that is included in the learning in the domain of learning, not in the domain of acquisition. So, there is a kind of a whatever you learn is based on that monitoring hypothesis. Then there is this natural order hypothesis that he talks about. This is something we have seen before also in terms of when we discussed morphology. Same kind of theory can be applied for second language acquisition as well. So, there are a natural order through which we learn the rules of a language. L2 in this case, there is a natural order. So, you will not learn some of the most complex ones first and the easier ones last. So, there is a natural order. Input hypothesis, one of his most important contribution. What he talks about in terms of input hypothesis is that depending on the kind of comprehensible input, that has been one of his most important contribution, and also something that has been debated upon heavily, that the input has to be comprehensible. What it means is that it should be understood and there should be enough of it. So, basically until and unless you have adequate input which is comprehensible, which is easily understandable, and that there is adequate amount of it, the person learning the L2 will not be able to learn it properly. So, that is the idea, input has to be comprehensible and enough. Of course, this has been a very complicated idea and has been debated a lot, but this is what he provided. And necessary grammar is also automatically provided. All of these should be part of what he calls input. And then affective filter hypothesis, this is also important. The person's affective state is also important. In fact, this was later on picked up by many other researchers and have been discussed in detail, Pika for example, but input may not be processed if the affective filter is up. This is what is called. So, there should be no filter, affective filter while learning. If that is in place, then we will not be able to learn. So, individuals are inhibited, then the learning will be affected. So, of course, Krashen is the proponent of this theory, and then of our universal grammar. universal grammar, Chomsky's proposal, we have already discussed this in detail. So, we are not getting into the primary ideas. The basic idea was that principles and parameters, we have an underlying grammar, universal grammar that is available to everybody. So, the primary when we are bringing universal grammar to second language acquisition, the primary thesis has been around whether the UG is available while you are learning second language L2, because UG was available and in the beginning and your L1 acquisition has made good use of it. Is it still available for use in SLA? That has been the main question that has been around for a very long time. So, the primary divisions that they make is, these are the 3 domains, 3 main important ideas. Within this, the initial state in SLA, nature of interlanguage and how does it change over time, and the final state. So, the beginning, the intermediate stages and the final stage, 3 stages, and what is the role of universal grammar in all of this. So, initial stage as the name suggests is the beginning of SLA journey. So, once principles and parameters are set to L1, because we have already seen that our as per universal grammar L1, understanding L1 or acquiring L1 is largely based on these factors. So, your parameters are already set, principles are already there, parameters have been set. This is the scenario when L2 makes an entry. So, it is already set to L1. Now, those parameters may adversely affect their L2 if they are different. For example, let us take an example of Hindi and English in terms of postposition and preposition. So, in English you have preposition, in Hindi you have postposition, many other languages also have. So, in English you have on the table, in Hindi table ke upar. So, the preposition, postposition, these parameters are different with this. So, if this is the case, then your L2 SLA will be affected, second language acquisition will be affected. This is how it is explained. So, there are debates about whether the learner still has access to UG or not. So, this is of course a very hotly debated area. And there are various stages of access that has been proposed by many scholars, but we are not getting there. This is due to paucity of time. So, whatever, so depending on who is proposing, there have been many theories. Some say that we have full access to UG even when you are learning your L2. Some say that there is no access, and there are many other theories that say partial access. So, this is around which the idea is based. And then comes our interlanguages in between, after initial stage and before final stage we have initial intermediate stages. So, principles and parameters will define interlanguage as IL1, IL2, IL3. So, stages of the interim grammars between after the initial state, and this is where your parameters are getting set to the new language. So, this is the idea. So, here this was called interim grammar in the 60s and 70s. So, if the learner has access to UG, then IL is resetting the parameters as per the new inputs, and that is what most of the researchers are converging on, that at least there should be partial access if parameters have to work. So, you have initially your L1 parameters were utilized for L2, and eventually if you have, because the UGs are still there, you will be resetting the parameters for L2 depending on the kind of input that you are getting, and thereby you go to the final state. So, final state is relevant of course only in case of SLA, because this entire thing is because in case of L1 this will not be relatable, this will not be relevant. Why? Because irrespective of whichever language, wherever you are speaking, all native speakers of a language are expected to master that. There is no difference between one native speaker and another native speaker, that universal grammar that this paradigm identifies. So, all native speakers are equally competent, but that is not the case with L2. So, in L2 this is a very important concept, that there is a final state, and this might be different from one speaker to another. So, all learners may not have the same final state. Now, what will this depend on? This will depend on various factors. So, what is the final state speaker 1 achieves versus another speaker 2 or 3 will depend on these parameters. So, these factors. So, one of them is of course, the degree of access to UG, different input in qualitative terms, and then relationship between L1 and L2 also might decide the level of transfer and so on. So, there are multiple factors which play a role in terms of attaining our final state with respect to SLA from the universal grammar perspective. And of course, the leading scholar in this domain is Chomsky, and there are many others researchers who have contributed to this. I will add their references in the end, but this is the, of course, Chomsky is the main name. So, this is where we complete this segment. In the next lecture, we will take up some other theories from the functional perspective. Thank you.